It wasn't just a revolution, it was a bloodbath. France didn't rise up overnight, it exploded. The streets were on fire with anger, mobs hunted down enemies of the people, and the royal court was collapsing fast. Families vanished, the elite prayed for mercy and rarely got it. And this was just the warm-up. The reign of terror was still waiting in the wings. We are uncovering the insanity of it all in today's episode of the Infographic Show. Why the French Revolution was even crazier than you think. By the late 18th century, France was a farming nation. 21 million of its 26 million people were peasants, barely surviving on small plots. The poor paid taxes, the rich did not. After funding the American Revolution to spite Britain for past losses, France was broke, half its revenue went to debt. Meanwhile, 400,000 nobles owned a fifth of the land, traded on the stock market, and shared their privileges with the church. Louis XVI wanted tax reform, but it had to pass through the Estates General, where the nobles and clergy could outvote the Third Estate, 98% of the population. Everyone knew the system was rigged. On June 20th, 1789, the Third Estate arrived in Versailles and found the doors locked, allegedly for cleaning. They knew it was a shutout, so they gathered in a nearby tennis court and they declared themselves the National Assembly, the voice of all France. The tennis court oath marked the true beginning of the revolution. But inside the royal palace, life went on unchanged. Marie Antoinette lived lavishly at Versailles, spending on fashion and gambling while her peasants starved. After years of a sexless marriage, she had only 4 children, only one survived. Reformists wanted a constitution and fairer taxes, not a revolution. Moderates like Mirabeau and Lafayette tried to guide the monarchy, but Louis ignored them. Too busy, hunting and feasting. The entire country was cracking beneath him, he just couldn't hear it. As reformers drafted a constitution, Louis quietly summoned 6 regiments toward Paris, and then 10 as riots spread. Troops surrounded the city, fights broke out, mobs rioted, reformists were hailed, their enemies beaten. In the countryside, Enlightenment thinkers warned the king planned to dissolve the National Assembly. They spread pamphlets calling for resistance, maybe even civil war. Meanwhile, bread prices soared and nobles were accused of hoarding grain to starve the Third Estate into submission. Mobs flooded the streets, looting weapons from gunsmiths and cutlers. At the Hôtel de Ville, reformists, mostly middle-class professionals, claimed authority over Paris and organized the National Guard to restore order on their terms. Meanwhile, chaos escalated. Stones were thrown at soldiers, arrests were made and reversed by angry crowds, but the protesters lacked one thing: guns. On July 14th, as rumors spread of royal troops entering the city, a permanent committee was formed. Crowds gathered at the Paris Invalides, where a massive weapons cache was stored. The governor tried to calm them, but no one listened. Just a quarter-mile away, 5,000 royal troops camped on the Champ de Mars. Many sympathized with the desperate crowd and were unwilling to open fire. Some even said they would rather join the rioters. The mob seized 29,000 to 32,000 muskets and 10 cannons from the Invalides, but they still lacked cartridges and gunpowder. The solution was the Bastille, a 14th century fortress and symbol of noble tyranny. Once a place of torture and exile, it now held only 7 prisoners and gunpowder, making it both strategic and symbolic. The drawbridge was raised, the windows shuttered, soldiers atop the towers hurled stones at the advancing crowd, men, women, even children. But they didn't fire. The governor claimed the cannons weren't loaded and no one would shoot, but the crowd jeered. Men attacked the pulleys with axes and hammers. As the drawbridge began to lower, the crowd surged forward. Then came the cannon blasts and musket fire. Bullets flew, people dove for cover. Some fell, others screamed. Members of the permanent committee rushed in trying to stop the bloodshed, but it was all too late. Bodies were already being carried out on stretchers. Fearing the violence would spread, they again urged the governor to surrender. Inside, guards waved white handkerchiefs, but the mob didn't stop. As the bridge dropped, guards were seized. Teeth clenched with rage, men and women swore that they would see them hanged. The plan was to send the prisoners to the Hôtel de Ville. But when one man shouted that a guard had kicked him, the mood turned. The mob exploded. Bayonets thrust into the accused. Cries of traitors rang out. The man who had been kicked took a knife, and as the crowd screamed, "Take his head," he began to cut. The extreme violence of the French Revolution was now in full flow. The mob paraded through the streets with severed heads on pikes, cheering as more blood was spilled. The so-called vainqueurs of the Bastille were hailed as heroes. The symbol of royal power had fallen, but as the fortress was torn down stone by stone, the revolution was already shifting, led by men with diverging versions for France. When the king learned of the Bastille falling, he asked, "Is this a revolt?" The reply was, "No, sire, this is a revolution." Reformists demanded the return of Jacques Necker, the progressive finance minister whose dismissal had helped ignite the revolution. Reluctantly, Louis addressed the National Assembly and announced the withdrawal of royal troops from Paris and Versailles. The streets of Paris buzzed with hope and energy. Among the crowd was Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman and American war hero, now a leading voice of reason in the French Revolution. He reassured the people, insisting that the king had simply been misled by his advisors. Lafayette was commander of the citizens' militia, soon renamed the National Guard. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, astronomer and National Assembly leader, was appointed mayor of Paris. To unite the city and the crown, the men wore cockades of red and blue, the colors of Paris, with white for the king. The tricolor was born. The mood was hopeful, but cracks remained. Necker wasn't reinstated, and peasants were still hungry, and distrust lingered. The people were right not to trust the king. In secret, he was already making plans to flee France with the queen, his mistress, and their 4 children. Under immense pressure, Louis rode to Paris. People lined the roads, clutching weapons and shouting "Vive la Nation" and "Vive Monsieur Lafayette," but not long live the king. The king looked more like a prisoner than a monarch. At the Hôtel de Ville, Mayor Bailly handed the king the tricolor cockade. Surrounded by armed citizens, Louis had no choice but to accept. He pinned it to his hat and climbed the steps, flanked by drawn swords and loaded muskets. The crowd cheered. The monarch now belonged to the Third Estate. Outside Paris, chaos spread. Riots erupted across towns and villages. Landowners fled as manor houses were looted, grain stores pillaged, and forbidden lands hunted and fished. Beggars, peasants, even middle-class families roamed the countryside, heading for the cities ready to join the revolution. It wasn't the outcome the moderates had planned. It was anarchy, fueled by rumors of counter-revolution and incendiary newspapers that had whipped mobs up into a frenzy. One man was hanged from a lamppost. His son-in-law suffered worse, his heart cut out and pinned to a wall outside the Hôtel de Ville. Their heads were paraded through the streets on pikes as crowds laughed and cheered. It was grotesque, like nothing anyone had seen before. But it was the new normal. Crowds now screamed for more heads. Each day brought fresh rumors, counter-revolution, royal plots, foreign armies on their way to crush the people. The Spanish were coming, then the Poles, the British. Fear gripped the streets and newspapers poured fuel on the fire. No one did it more eagerly than Jean-Paul Marat, the radical voice behind the newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people. He demanded blood, calling for vigilance, for purges, for more executions. His words helped spark the Great Fear, a wave of national panic that swept cities and villages. The National Assembly had unleashed something it couldn't control. Talk turned to tearing down the feudal order, abolishing noble titles, religious privilege, and rewriting the tax code. The Assembly even drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, declaring all men born and remain free and in equal rights. But little changed for the peasants. The liberals talked, some prospered, the poor still starved. When word spread that the king had thrown a lavish ball at Versailles where women wore white cockades and drunk soldiers tore off their tricolors to toast the monarchy, fury exploded in the streets. As people queued for bread that they could barely afford, radicals called for action. The average French citizen ate 4 pounds of bread daily, spending half of their wages on it, most of the rest on firewood and lighting. Prices soared, people chose between food and heat. Riots erupted, armed guards stood watch at bakeries. Meanwhile, at Versailles, the royals dined on delicacies and reportedly mocked the revolution. It was too much to bear. It was the women who snapped first. 7,000 marched on Versailles armed with knives, scythes, muskets, and pitchforks. Some men joined them, a few dressed as women. They looted shops along the way, determined to bring the king back to Paris. At the Hôtel de Ville, officials tried to calm the crowd. As a compromise, a small group of women were chosen to accompany the members of the National Assembly to Versailles. When they arrived at the palace, the people demanded bread. The king promised them all that Versailles had, but it never came. Outrage followed and threats of violence with the queen as the prime target. That night, Louis XVI was pressured to sign decrees, including accepting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and an agreement to move to Paris. Convinced the crisis had passed, he dismissed the women as crude and hysterical, and then he went to bed. But the trouble wasn't over, it was just getting started. In the middle of the night, the queen heard shouting and footsteps outside of her room. A mob was storming the palace, angry, desperate, and half-mad from hunger and grief. Their children were starving, dying from disease. When a guard fired into the crowd, someone was hit. Enraged, the mostly female mob grabbed another guard and decapitated him with an axe. An officer, blood streaming from his face, tried to block the queen's door. Marie Antoinette leapt from the bed, struggling to dress as guards urged her to flee. She ran barefoot to the king's chambers. Moments later, a mob burst through the door. Women with wild eyes slashing at the empty bed with daggers and swords. At the king's quarters, the door remained locked as the women pounded on it with their fists. Lafayette was urgently summoned and rode to Versailles, where he found men and women parading severed heads on pikes. Surrounded by rage and rumors of betrayal, one man dressed as a woman threatened Lafayette's life. Others shouted for his death after the king and queen were delivered to Paris. Lafayette convinced the king to face the crowd. When Marie Antoinette appeared with her children, bloodied faces screamed. Some raised muskets, but she stood firm. Slowly, rage gave way to reluctant admiration. Lafayette kissed her hand, and the crowd responded with uneasy respect. The royal family agreed to return to Paris. As they walked to their carriage, some threatened to dip the queen's hands in a dead man's entrails. Others danced, many drunk, still hungry but triumphant. With the king now in the capital, fierce debates erupted in the National Assembly. Louis was no longer king of France, but king of the French, bound by a new constitution and a government committed to the people's rights. For now, he swore to uphold it. Crowds cheered on the Champ de Mars, and by spring and summer of 1791, it felt as if France had been reborn. There were still outbreaks of violence, peasants suffered, but salons buzzed and cafes thrived. The aristocracy walked in the streets in peace. Yet the king, quiet and withdrawn, grew restless. He couldn't move without the National Guard. The queen remained a target, accused of decadence and secretly funneling money to Austria, while French peasants starved. So in secret, the king listened as counter-revolutionaries urged him to prepare for civil war, flee France and wait for the order to be restored. The plan was to escape to Austria, where his brother-in-law would raise an army and crush the revolution once and for all. On June 20th, 1791, the king, queen, and their children slipped out of Paris under the cover of night. They had little money. They feared selling Marie Antoinette's jewels would raise suspicion. In plain clothes, they set off for the Austrian frontier, hoping to rally troops along the way, but none appeared. When their carriage was stopped in a village, locals grew suspicious of the well-dressed family. Soon they were caught red-handed, humiliated, and afraid. Back in Paris, the king's empty bed had already been discovered, and orders were issued to intercept the escape. Some blamed Lafayette, accusing him of secretly aiding the royals. The queen, surrounded by National Guardsmen, gave up. He resigned himself to a return not just to Paris, but to deeper disgrace. Now he would be accused of abandoning his people. Baying crowds awaited the royal family's return. Faces filled every window. People climbed trees just to catch a glimpse. Signs were nailed to the trees and walls. One warned anyone who cheers the king will be flogged. With heads bowed, the king and queen climbed to the palace steps, their children behind them. Humiliated, the king turned to Lafayette and muttered, "Well, I seem to be more at your orders than you are at mine." The monarchy was doomed. Its defenders within the revolution were finished. Mirabeau, the voice of moderation, was dead, aged 42. Lafayette, once a hero, was now met with suspicion. Bailly, the staunch constitutional monarchist, faded into the background, a relic of a more hopeful time, now accused of being blind to the royal family's duplicity. In their place came something new and far more volatile. Across Paris, political clubs buzzed with energy. Jacobins, Cordeliers, and others, filled with voices ranging from idealists to bloodthirsty fanatics, all ready to ignite mobs with a few words. A power vacuum had opened, and violence rushed in. The revolution's new face was Maximilien Robespierre, a brilliant lawyer and a committed Jacobin. Alongside him were Georges Danton, a charismatic firebrand he would one day execute, and Jean-Paul Marat, whose incendiary newspaper demanded mass purges. Jacques Hébert riled up mobs with vulgar, violent rhetoric. From the Cordeliers and the streets came the sans-culottes, working-class militants demanding justice through blood. The revolution was entering its most dangerous phase, a spiral of fear, purges, and fanaticism. For the peasants, the promise of 1789 felt empty. The revolution's leaders were educated, well-off men with personal ambitions. While they gained power, the peasants gained little. It was the middle class that benefited the most, steering the revolution to serve their own interests. Many top landowners had fled France, but their agents still remained, still collecting taxes. 2 years after the Bastille fell, the poor were still slaves to the feudal class. At the time, the Girondins held power in the assembly. They agreed to pursue absentee landowners suspected of raising armies abroad. One man stood up and shouted that to save the country, the gangrenous limbs must be amputated. Behind closed doors, Marie Antoinette called the new constitution monstrous and secretly wrote to Austria pleading for help to crush the revolution. The king has always wavered. Prussia pushed for war while Britain hesitated. Under pressure, Louis told the assembly France would go to war with Austria and Prussia, a war that it couldn't afford. Secretly, he hoped that foreign armies would restore his power, but even a hint of betrayal could cost him his head. From the start, the war was a disaster. Rumors spread that the royals were conspiring with the enemy. Louis' 6,000-man guard was dismissed and replaced by 20,000 National Guardsmen, heightening tensions in Paris. On the right, monarchists demanded that Louis' full powers be restored. On the left, the Girondins and Jacobins turned on each other. Marat openly called for the massacre of the revolution's enemies. Thousands of armed citizens, including women and children, stood ready to unleash their rage. Worse still, the king used his veto to block key revolutionary laws. To many, that was treason. Louis had declared war on the revolution, and the people were ready to respond. Then came the Brunswick Manifesto, a threat from the Prussian and Austrian commander to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed. They would execute any National Guardsmen who didn't support the king. It was the excuse the revolutionaries had been waiting for. These Tuileries, or citizen soldiers, swore to defend liberty. One critic called them a gang of assassins. The assembly knew it was losing control. Then, on a scorching August day, 20,000 people marched on the palace. Only 900 Swiss guards stood between them and the royal family, backed by 2,000 National Guardsmen, many unsure whether to defend the king at all. Sensing a massacre, Louis XVI went to the assembly claiming that he wished to prevent a great crime, but the assembly's grip on power was slipping. Soon after, the sans-culottes stormed the chamber demanding the deputies swear an oath to uphold liberty and equality. Refusal meant death. Back at the palace, chaos erupted. The Swiss guard opened fire on the crowd, unaware that the king had already ordered them to stand down. The mob stormed the palace, cutting down surrendering soldiers and slaughtering cooks, pages, ushers, and maids. Women were thrown from windows, men decapitated, their heads stuck on pikes. The palace was looted and destroyed. Roughly 600 Swiss guards were massacred. 300 palace staff, including at least 3 women, were also killed. The king took refuge in the temple, a medieval fortress turned prison. Paris was in chaos. Aristocrats who had once been ignored went into hiding. Others were arrested with their families and packed into overcrowded jails. The new Minister of Justice, Georges Danton, stepped forward, bringing justice in the form of blood. More than anyone had imagined. He had risen through the populist Courtelis Club, and with him at the helm, the revolution was about to go into overdrive. Spies and counter-revolutionaries were hunted down. Vigilance committees roamed the streets. Jean-Paul Marat and Jacques Ibert fueled panic through their newspapers, warning that if foreign armies reached Paris, the prisoners would rise and join them. The prisons had to be purged, and the mobs obeyed. They stormed the prisons, killing nearly everyone inside. Most were men, but some were women. Even the mad and the sick in the prison hospitals were slaughtered. The Princess de Lamballe, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, was struck with a pike and stabbed to death. The mob paraded through the streets with the head of Comte de Montmorency, the king's former foreign minister. All of this was carried out by around 150 to 200 assassins. They were not professionals. They were butchers, artisans, shopkeepers, and a few members of the younger National Guard. They believed that they were serving the revolution and even demanded payment for their work. The mobs butchered around 1,200 to 1,600 people. 37 of the victims were women, 66 children. Fewer than a third were nobles. The rest were thieves, forgers, vagrants, and ordinary people. The very kind the revolution was supposed to help. Jacques-Nicolas Biot-Varennes, a lawyer and close ally of Robespierre, praised their actions. Slaying enemies of the people, he said, was a patriotic duty. In August 1792, the National Convention was formed. It abolished the monarchy and granted voting rights to all men regardless of class. The French Republic was born. Peace was nowhere in sight. The Girondins and Jacobins turned on each other, each accusing the other of seizing too much power. The Jacobins, now the dominant in the convention, became known as the Montagnards, the most radical faction. Their leading voice, Maximilien Robespierre, believed virtue and justice could only be achieved through terror. The wave of executions that followed would come to be known as the Reign of Terror. The Montagnards demanded the king's execution, and only a few Girondins objected. Outside, armed sans-culottes filled the streets, shouting for death. Fear hung heavy in the air. The vote became a national obsession. In cafes, drunken men and women placed bets on the outcome, but the result was inevitable. The king would die. The scaffold was set up in the Place de Louis XV, soon renamed the Place de la Révolution. The men who sent people there didn't see themselves as brutes. They now had a device that could execute swiftly and painlessly. Invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, a crowd gathered as Louis walked to the scaffold to the beat of drums. Whispers turned to jeers. His neck was thick, but the blade was sharp. It fell cleanly, snapping the head clean off. A guard held the head aloft in the air, and then came the cry, "Vive la nation!" Vive la République! People rushed to the scaffold to dip handkerchiefs in the blood. One man even touched some to his tongue. The execution of Louis XVI sent shockwaves across Europe. In England, it was seen as a descent into barbarism. Soon after, the National Convention declared war on Britain, Spain, and Holland, joining ongoing conflicts with Austria and Prussia. France was now at war with most of Europe. Its revolutionary ideals terrified monarchies and nobles everywhere. Meanwhile, the revolution turned inward. The Girondins were branded traitors by the Montagnards, backed by the Sans-Culottes. In June 1793, the Girondins were purged from the convention, a coup in all but name. The country erupted in revolt. In the conservative Vendée, peasants launched a bloody royalist uprising. Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux followed as royalists and federalists rose up. France was now at war on all fronts, abroad and at home. Amid the chaos, Danton refused a seat on the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre stepped into the void and took control. With the revolution in his grip and the people still demanding blood, he became its driving force. Then Jean-Paul Marat was murdered, stabbed to death by a young woman named Charlotte Corday, a supporter of the Girondins. Robespierre had the excuse he wanted to make heads roll. The traitors had to go. Terror became the word of the day as the guillotine blade worked overtime. The queen was confined to a small cell in the conciergerie, a palace turned prison. She rarely spoke and wasn't surprised when found guilty of conspiring with enemies of the Republic. Charges included depleting the treasury and plotting counter-revolution. She didn't react when sentenced to death. Pale and trembling, she was paraded through the streets in the open cart as the city screamed at her. At the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me, sir," she said. "I did not do it on purpose." Those were the last words of her life. That same month, several Girondin leaders followed Charlotte Corday to the guillotine. Heads continued to fall, men and women alike. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, once Paris's mayor and a hero of the revolution, was next. But the terror didn't stop. Thousands more were executed. Thousands more lived in fear, especially beyond Paris. Much of the fear came from Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, one of the revolution's most radical voices and a close ally of Robespierre. Nicknamed the Angel of Death, he helped shape the ideology behind the Reign of Terror. Even indifference, he declared, was grounds for punishment. Then came new decrees. Radicals claimed wealthy farmers were guilty by default, hoarding grain. The law of suspects gave the state sweeping power to arrest anyone deemed an enemy. The guillotine became a daily spectacle. Men and women, rich and poor, died for vague or petty accusations. Jean-Henri, age 18, a tailor, was executed for cutting down a tree. Henriette François de Marboeuf, a 55-year-old widow, was executed for allegedly hoping that the Austrians and Prussians would save France and save food for them. François Bertrand was guillotined for serving sour wine to soldiers in his tavern. Another man lost at cards and in a fit of anger muttered something unpatriotic. He too was executed. Wealthy citizens were condemned simply for being rich. Their homes were looted and blown apart in acts of violence. No one was safe. Historian Christopher Hibbert wrote about a woman brought from prison to the scaffold, only for officials to realize her name merely resembled that of the intended victim. The prosecutor reportedly said, "Since she's here, we might as well take her." Cases like this were unfolding across France. In one town, Joseph Fouché, a former teacher turned hardline Jacobin and future minister of police under Napoleon, decided the guillotine was too painless. After putting down the insurrection in Lyon, he had around 200 people executed by cannon fire. But he used grape shot. A witness described the scene as heaps of mutilated, screaming, half-dead victims who were finished off with sabers and musket fire by soldiers. Fouché put nearly 2,000 people to death. Like with so many people, power had gone to his head. He was a tyrant. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Even committed revolutionaries grew sick of the bloodshed, the stench, the fear, the endless executions. It was too much. Yet, speaking out risked death. Georges Danton, no stranger to violence, finally said enough. A committee of clemency formed, but it was too late. The revolution was devouring itself. Paranoia ruled. Robespierre, convinced that he was surrounded by traitors, turned on both the Dantonists and the Hébertists. Danton and other moderates had to be executed. Danton's trial was rigged. He knew it. On April 5, 1794, just before the blade fell, he said, "Show my head to the people. It's worth seeing." The revolution was imploding, and it was coming for everyone. Anywhere from 16,000 to 40,000 people were executed during the Reign of Terror. In the official count, the lower estimate, only 9% were nobles and just 6% clergy. The rest, about 85%, were from the Third Estate, many of them peasants. The people the revolution was supposed to help. No one was safe. Robespierre called for more purges, more executions, more enemies to name and destroy. He outlawed dissent. He shut down churches. He claimed his personal sense of virtue justified the killings. But the mood was shifting. More voices began to say what had once been unthinkable. The terror was no longer justified. Then Robespierre gave a chilling speech to the convention, hinting at a new wave of traitors but refusing to name them. His colleagues looked around the chamber in fear. He had to be stopped. And on July 27, 1794, the convention turned on him. Robespierre was denounced, accused of making things worse and executing loyal revolutionaries. As he tried to speak, shouts drowned him out. Armed police escorted him and Saint-Just from the chamber. That night, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and his brother Augustin and a few loyalists fled to the Hôtel de Ville, hoping the Paris Commune would rise in their defense. But no army came. His support had vanished. In the early morning, soldiers stormed the building. Robespierre was shot in the jaw and collapsed, blood pouring from his shattered face. He tried to write an appeal to arms, but only managed the letters R and O before the page was soaked in blood. The next day, Robespierre lay in agony at the offices of the Committee of Public Safety, his face mangled as a surgeon removed shattered teeth and jawbone. He spent his last hours in excruciating pain. By late afternoon, he was carted to the Place de la Révolution. The partisan mobs were already gathered, screaming for blood. As he neared the scaffold, a woman broke through the crowd and shouted at his broken face, "Go now, evil one! Go down into your grave!" His brother and Saint-Just were executed first. Saint-Just, who had once declared that only a sea of blood could bring the revolution, was dead. When Robespierre was placed beneath the blade, his lower jaw dropped from his face and blood gushed from his mouth. He let out a primal scream that was silenced by the blade. He had no last words. With the most radical revolutionaries gone, the revolution swung sharply right. Across France, those who once enforced the Red Terror were hunted in the White Terror. Royalist mobs lynched former Jacobins, beating many to death. By 1795, the poor people were still starving. Speculators and the wealthy had prospered. Most saw no change. The gap between the rich and the poor remained as wide as under the king. People began to ask, what was it all for? Wars raged. The economy was in crisis. Royalists pushed to restore the monarchy. Jacobins wanted another shot at revolution. The National Guard, now dominated by the bourgeoisie, kept order. Immigrés returned, and purged Girondins were honored as martyrs. Meanwhile, Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed king, declared himself king in exile. Plans were already being made for a violent royalist restoration. In October 1795, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte crushed a royalist uprising in Paris with grape shot, instantly becoming a national hero. A year later, his victorious campaign against Austria boosted both his fame and political power. France was now ruled by the Directory, a five-man executive meant to represent moderate governance. Its new constitution claimed the nation should be led by its best citizens, with equality defined not as sameness but as fairness. But Napoleon had other ideas. On November 9, 1799, he staged a coup and became dictator in all but name. By 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. The revolution was over, and the Republic had become an empire. The French Revolution didn't just rewrite history, it put on a blood-soaked show. Watch The Guillotine, Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind, to find out how one quick and painless machine turned killing into entertainment. Or click on this video instead.